This is going to be a pretty simple painting of a barn. I've drawn the barn. I've also drawn some mountains in the background. Here's a tree line back here. I've drawn two large trees behind the barn, some bushes and ground cover over here, and I'm also going to add a little bit over here a little later. It's a simple drawing, and the barn is certainly convincing, but there's some cool stuff going on in it, and I thought before I started painting I'd point that out. First of all, this roof line here, if you'll notice that line, number one, it's not at all straight. It's sloping down very much on the right side of this picture. The other thing that's really significant about the roof line is it's only partly drawn in. This area here is not going to be drawn in, and it's going to produce a very cool result later. The lower edge of the roof line is also sloping down to the right, but the bottom edge of the barn is sloping up to the right. The same thing applies on the other side. The bottom is sloping up, and if you look at these two corners here, that line is sloping down. What this is all telling us is that our eyes are on a level of somewhere around here, on the same level as the horizon and the same level at which all these various lines converge. These lines here, these lines here. This may seem subtle to a beginner, but that's what makes this drawing work, is those little subtleties, because otherwise the barn would look wrong. Before you start painting anything, the first thing you got to concern yourself about is the light source. In this case here, the light source, sun, is going to be over my right shoulder, which means to my right and behind me. It's also going to be about halfway up the sky, and that's nice because it projects long shadows, but not very long shadows. It really makes very pretty pictures. Noon is a really dull time to paint. There's no shadows to speak of at all. We'll begin with the sky. This is a watercolor brush, but it need not be a watercolor brush. It could be a house painter brush. It could be a sponge or a rag. It could be anything. But what I'm doing is soaking the paper, and I really want to soak it. I want to soak it everywhere except immediately adjacent to the house, and I want to soak it down to maybe a line around here, maybe even a little lower. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that the paper is wet enough so that when we paint wet paint on there, it doesn't suck it right up, but rather gives me some working time. I don't have to go up to the house because I don't need a ton of working time up against the house. But for the general area, the background, I would like to have working time, and I would like to have paint flowing freely around in the water. That's what gives us a watercolor effect. So I'm just taking my time about this, getting plenty of water on. You can check my lesson on preparing paper for wet painting to get a better idea of what I'm doing here. But I'm being pretty serious about getting this paper wet. The paper's thick, so what's happening is the top is wet, the bottom still isn't. It's completely dry, as a matter of fact, if you picked it up and touched it. So there's some curling going on because the top surface is expanding. That's what paper does when it's wet, and the bottom surface is not. That's good enough. Now I'm going to switch to my 1-inch flat, and I'm going to start with my sedimentary blue. In this case here, a cerulean blue. I'm just putting it on the palette just to make sure that there's no thick spots in there. And I'm going to paint in some clouds here. See how this beautiful effect starts to happen? These little fingers are sticking out. You can make much more realistic clouds if you like, but what I'm doing is creating a cloud effect over here so that, well, I don't have to bring this down. That's going to be tree. So that this area remains unpainted there. And I guess I'll just go in here, allowing another little cloud or two. And then mostly I want to paint this in, but I want the sky to get very light down at the bottom, which is only natural. And here I need my sky coming like that. And I don't mind painting my sky right down into the mountains, right down into the trees, because what I want is a very soft edge so that when I paint other stuff over there, that hard edge doesn't show through. So that's a very soft edge, and I can leave that. While this is drying a little bit, so that the paint is somewhat less mobile, let's start mixing up a green. I'm going to use this blue here, my ultramarine blue. I'm switching to ultramarine blue just because cerulean is so expensive. This stuff is a much cheaper paint. I'm also going to clean my brush pretty well on my hand towel before picking up some yellow here. And I'm going to make a light green, and I actually need a good bit of it, so why don't I get plenty? There we go. And I'm going to take this light green. I want it not too thin because we don't need a lot of water here because we've got a lot of water there. And I'm just going to paint it in gently where my trees end. And this is why I need to paint in now right to the edge of my roof. And I'm going to get my trees, going to get the edges in here. I see that I'm not nearly dark enough. That's much better. I'm going to paint the edges of my trees in here. I've kind of lost them. I can't see them anymore, but I really don't care because they're just watercolor trees. That's good. I'm going to begin mixing my color on the paper, and I'm going to switch to my 1/2 inch flat. And I'm going to put in darker greens in here. They will spread so nicely if I just put everything in really wet. I'm going to start putting in blues here. I guess I'll put this brush down here. Put in some blues now. Strong, strong greens. I'm painting in the shadow side of first this tree. I want to keep the water flowing. I want to keep this wet, but I certainly want to get my colors nice and strong. Here is the shadow side over here. Down in here. I want to put some bush type vegetation here, so I'm going to need some yellow for the top of it to suggest sunlight, and blue for the bottom of it to suggest shadow. And I think we'll let that do, except that I'm not happy with what's happening up here. So I'm just going to take some more green put it in here, here, and why don't I leave that alone? That looks like watercolor. I think I just want to clean this up. I see I got a little yellow down into my roof. I'll fix that when the time comes. Since this is the shadow side of the tree, I don't mind doing a little of this. What you're seeing here is just a little studio light reflected. Now, I'm going to deal with these mountains over here in the background. Let's take some of this green and neutralize some red here. Okay, well, that's too red. Here we go. There's a kind of purplish color. I'm going to paint it thin. First, I'm going to try to lift the edge of these mountains. I don't have to. They're sort of drying. And I'm just going to paint in with this purple. I'm not painting wet because I don't want a whole lot of water propelling the paint up into the sky and giving me fuzzy mountains. These pencil lines over here, I will just erase a little bit later. But I need to get my roof line just so over here. And if I want to suggest that one mountain is somewhat nearer, I can mix just a little bit of green in there and pull this mountain slightly more forward. Now, while that's wet, I'm going to paint in a tree line back there. It's distant, so we need to mute the green down a little bit. And how do you mute green? With a little bit of red. Red is on the opposite side of the color wheel from green, and it will neutralize the green, make it a duller green. And again, we're going to, whoa, see, too much water. I got to do that over. Because things are a little wet, we can get a fuzzy edge, which is exactly what I want. But I need it much darker. Is some yellow, a little blue. That's a dark green, a little red. Okay. There we go. That'll do it. Oh yeah. We're not painting trees. We're painting a tree line that's going to separate the foreground from the distance. One thing about a tree line, as is so many things in nature, they are irregular. So you don't want, you see how this tree's coming up high? You don't want a whole bunch of trees in a row coming up to the same height so it looks like a picket fence. You want a big variety of height, shapes. At this distance, not much of a color variety, but some. And then because the bottom is going to be unclear as to where it stops, because this is distance after all, I'm going to just take some fresh clean water, pretty clean water, and just soften this edge. That's enough. We're only suggesting things, just like that. Before I start painting the barn, this would be a good time to show you a trick. If I were going to paint the roof, then I'd probably just wet this yellow spot and wipe it up. Do that a couple times and it would come up. But since I'm not going to paint the roof and I want to get this yellow up, about the easiest way to do it is just to scratch it up with a knife, just taking off the surface of the paper. The top's dry. I've moved the clips from my bottom to the top. Let's paint a barn. Barns are red. I'm going to use this red here. This is a quinacridone red, and it's much too bright a red. So I'm going to use some of my sedimentary red here to dull it down a good amount. I think I might even add a little touch of my orange, my yellow here, my very warm yellow. And I want to keep it light. I want to keep a light color red. It's a light red because it's in the light. I read about this graduate student. He wanted to know why people painted barns red, so he asked a farmer. The farmer said, I paint it red because red's the cheapest paint. So he went to the paint store and said, why is red the cheapest paint? The guy said, because I sell so much of it. We don't have to stop painting the light when we get to the dark. We can keep right on painting if we want. Unless there's a significant reason not to, I like to paint the light side into the dark side as well, just so that when I paint the dark side, where the dark ends, the light will automatically begin and I won't have a little space there. It gives me a certain amount of freedom. The thing that makes something light is that there is a contrast against that which is dark. I'm going to take more of my red. I am going to take more of my sedimentary red. We've got a blood red there. I've got to make this a little darker. So how do you neutralize red? You use a green. And I'll just take this green right here and throw it right in, and now I have a darker red. I can throw in a little bit of blue as well. That will darken it. Blue is a color that belongs in landscape shadows, and in another lesson I'll explain why. And now we'll paint the shadow side. We have a shadow here, we water. And this is where I got to get this little edge in here because I don't want to leave any white spaces. Now, there are watercolor painters that are famous for leaving white spaces. That's their trademark. Just not mine. So we paint the dark side, and this is a good time to make sure this line is vertical. We paint the entire side right up to this edge. I don't want too wet here, because I don't want a little bit of paint going down. I want a lot of paint going down. Paint it right down to the bottom here. Now I plan to put some foundation material down in there, like grass or something. There will be a shadow under the roof, under the overhang of the roof, generated by the overhang of the roof. I think I want to make that just a little larger and make sure it's dark enough. That'll do. You've got this track that holds up the barn door, and I'm not going to paint the track at all. I'm only going to paint the shadow under the track. I've got some elements of the barn door. You're definitely going to see a few of them. You're going to see this. You're going to see this because it's facing downwards. You're going to see this because it's on the shadow side. The same goes for this. This is facing downward and on the shadow side. This is facing downward and on the shadow side, and this thing is facing upward on the shadow side. Now you're not going to see the top and the bottom and the sides. However, I'm going to suggest them. I'm just going to thin this down, make it light, make it fairly dry, and just paint in the rest of the door, not because you would see it, but because I have to tell you that it's there. I'm now going to take and make it still darker dark. I'm going to add blue to this until I've got something near a black. And I'm going to use that to fill up the empty space inside the barn. The open barn door. My brush is just a little wider than this space. If it was the same width as the space, it would be so easy to do this. Okay, and now there's a downward facing edge over here that we can see, and it would be quite believable that the shadow under here would be even darker, and that shadow would just go there. I don't think we need to do much more than this, but I'll show you a little trick. Let's go back to our sedimentary red, a little bit of this burnt sienna here, and I want a very, very dry brush. And I'm going to take this brush, I'm going to just drag it gently across the surface here. And now I have barn board. Everything here's dry. We'll start again with the same technique we used in the sky. We're going to wet the foreground now, including the lower edge of the red of the barn here, including a little bit of the trees in here. I won't keep going back in the trees because the next time I go in there, I'll start moving paint around. which is something I don't want to do, but I do want to make sure that everything is nice and wet. I want to know that my colors will be propelled around the painting exactly as I expect them to be. Now I'm going to paint in some vegetation. Let's just take a little lemon here. And, oh, here's some highlights out in the field. Out there. And, I don't know, maybe perhaps there's some foreground highlights to this green here. Let's take a sedimentary yellow, my yellow ochre. This is really an iron ore. And I'm going to let this right now, I tell you what, I'm going to wet the bottom of the barn before I go in there. Very, very bottom of it. And I can only do it once, because once I do it, the next time paint can move around. And now, when I put this stuff here up against the bottom, hopefully it's going to bleed upwards just a little bit. Give me a soft edge and tell me that there's growth going on here. I need some green. Certainly not a bright green, but a yellow green to suggest growy stuff. Don't think I made enough. Make some more. Yellow. Some blue. Plenty. Plenty of water. Let it go in. I don't want it too strong. What I'm doing here is horizontal strokes. Let it just happen. Let it paint in. These colors blend. Plenty of water now. I'm just wetting it, hoping that things will propel each other around and we will get some evenness there. I'm going to take this yellow. I'm going to bring it out to my tree line, suggesting more growy stuff, and soften it in here a bit. I could just use a little bit of vegetation now around the bottom of the barn, so we'll make some vegetation here. Here we go. No big deal, we're just suggesting some more stuff in here. There's some growy stuff along the bottom of the barn. There's a little more growy stuff here, and I definitely want to suggest some growing here and around the back, showing me that there's something going on here. Finally, I'm going to want a shadow to this barn, and I'll just take, I'll take some of my green, mix it with some of this yellow. Okay, there's a greenish yellow that's kind of nice. I'll take some of this red here and suggest the shadow of my barn. I don't want to be precision about it, but I do want it rooted somehow into the landscape here. Probably a little farther out. like that, and we'll call it done. You might want to play a little here and there with some paint, but not much. We kind of have it here. You certainly don't want to overdo any of this. And we can put a path here. We can bring a path through the grass with this same material. We just want to suggest that a path exists. So I don't want to throw soaking wet water in here, but we can suggest that there is a road going up into here, somewhere like this. What I'm doing here is not just fiddling around. As I'm looking at this painting, I've sensed that the barn is not connected to the foliage at the right. And what I had in mind in the beginning, and still, is that there be a single visual mass on the right-hand side. That is, the barn and the trees should be one. And right now they're not really connected. The subject of this painting is not just the barn. The subject of this painting is the barn and those trees. The way it looks now, it feels to me that the barn and the trees are not really visually one thing. So I'm going to darken the left side of the vegetation and the bottom of the vegetation in order to bring them together into one visual mass. When I'm done, I think you'll see why I'm doing this. It will make for a much better composition. I'm using some yellow, very wet yellow. Lead it out so that there is no line of demarcation there. Okay, I don't want to play with it any more than this. One of the things I really like about this painting is that this cloud and this roof are one piece. It forces the eye to draw a line that isn't there, and the eye is glad to do it. I think we're done. We have a nice composition here, a barn well rooted into its landscape.